Hi, welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast. I'm Boaz Soifer, and today we're very excited to welcome Dr. David Marshall. David is a China scholar and student of world religions. He's lived most in Seattle, Alaska, Kyushu Island in Japan, Taiwan, Oxford, and mainland China. He most recently taught American culture and public speaking at Peking University in China's capital. For his doctoral dissertation, he analyzed the relationship between Chinese and Western religious tradition, especially the Tao Te Ching and Chinese Christianity, focusing on the controversial claims of the philosopher Yuan Jingming, who helped lead the democracy movement in 1989. Uh, David enjoys teaching at both the college and high school levels, along with hiking, gardening, photography, and Seattle's sports teams when they win. I've got some parallels there, not Seattle, um, but the rest. David, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
It's great to have you. Um, I will let Brian start this off. He's been really excited to dig into the Tao Te Ching and all questions Taoist. So why don't you kick us off, Brian?
Great. Once again, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Marshall, for coming and spending your time with us. Um, the the Tao Te Ching, I think, for Westerners sits in a sort of a special place, and it's become a sort of a basket of ancient wisdom that I think a lot of folks uh, have maybe more vague ideas around than actually have been exposed to a background. We talk a lot on the podcast about hermeneutics, which is this general field of translating ancient texts, which means not just translating from ancient languages, but from ancient settings, ancient cultural worldviews. And the hermeneutic task is to bring the meaning payload from those ancient sources to something that we can actually make sense of and use in the modern world, in our lives, hopefully. And so the Tao Te Ching, to me, in our little pre-discussion, I was saying it's a work that I have spent a lot of time with, both as a young man and as I have aged. And I showed you I have a current version that I use, which is the Lin Yutang translation. Uh, and my original version, as I mentioned before, is in pieces because it's spent so much time and it's traveled with me. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And I have a sensibility for the job that we face when we try to get something real out of this. And so I'm really excited to be able to share time with you, David, because you've spent so much time and have gone deeper than the average person has the resource or attention to do. Um, the first thing that I wanted to look at is when we think about translating an ancient text, we think about grabbing a hold of an old book and cracking it open and looking at the old words and writing it down in our language. But with the Tao Te Ching, we're not exactly dealing with something that's straightforward, are we? Can you give us a little background about, like, when we're actually trying to get this, we end up with a bunch of bamboo sticks, don't we? Or or wooden uh, uh, branches. I was just hoping you could give us a background, like, what would a person see when they look at the old sources that we're taking this from?
Well, my professor of classical Chinese said that translating the Tao Te Ching was kind of like a coming out exercise for China scholars. It's a very short text, and everybody wants to try it. And last I checked, it had been translated at least 30 times into English, probably a lot more than that. However, as you said, it is a text that is a little hard to get a handle on in some cases. Some of it's fairly straightforward, but other parts are very enigmatic. And therefore, there's quite a little bit of controversy over what some of the key phrases actually mean. Which, if, for example, my two ancient languages are classical Chinese, which I can't claim to be an expert on, and Koine Greek. And so I'm not that great at Koine Greek either, but one thing is I would say is that reading the New Testament is in some ways much more straightforward translation than the Tao Te Ching would be.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things that have happened with the Tao Te Ching. Um, when I've translated things out of ancient Greek, out of Latin, out of French, out of German, out of Spanish, and all of these languages, they share certain things like subjects and objects and tenses, and they're all based on drawing the sound that we speak.
Yes.
But ancient Chinese is this whole other kind of thing going on, isn't it? Where we're drawing the idea, and the idea is kind of made and compounded out of other ideas, which of course we do with other languages as well. But it gives us a kind of another hurdle to jump over, would you say?
Yes, and Chinese does use sound in it creates new characters, by means of homonyms using, you know, words that sound the same and then drawing something similar to it. But generally speaking, mainland Chinese is a very, it has thousands of characters and each one of them has to be learned independently. There are radicals, which are used to make the characters, so it's not completely arbitrary, it's not completely a spider crawling across a piece of paper with ink on its 8 legs. Uh, However, it does take a lot of learning, a lot of time to learn enough characters to understand it, and then one of the difficulties of classical Chinese is that people assume they know what it means because they understand modern Chinese, for example, and you can't necessarily do that. You can't necessarily go from A to B that easily. Another thing is you have people like don't of those 30 translations, I'm not including someone like Stephen Mitchell, whose translation, so called, I would not recommend. Um, you have to have somebody who really knows ancient Chinese thought, and as you said, the background of the text is also very, very important. Um, People can just pick up the book and read it in English and get an idea of what the text is saying. However, each translator seems to have his own idea of those key terms. So, Lin Yutang, for example, you say you have Lin Yutang's text. Um, he is a very good writer. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize at one point. Uh, if you ever have a chance to visit his house up on the hill, Seven Star Mountain above Taipei, it's a fascinating place to visit. Li
Oh,
Yutang was
wow.
a very fluent writer, and he paid close attention to meaning, and he understood what the ancient texts meant. But he sometimes privileged fluidity, perhaps, over precise meaning. So one of his criticisms of James Legge, writes the classical translation of basically all the ancient Chinese classics, he felt that Legge was very kind of formal and not very poetic. So his translations of some of the texts really fit the original because those texts were in fact very formal and not very poetic. But his translation of the Tao Te Ching, the meaning is there. He does not mistranslate it, as like Lin Yutang said, but he doesn't always seem to be in sync with the feelings of the author and with the way of thinking of the author so much with the Tao Te Ching and with the Zhuangzi.
Right, and because, as you mentioned, languages aren't, like, frozen in time. Languages evolve, and we're talking about a text that I believe people attribute to the 6th century BC. So we're
Uh,
talking a long time ago that has gone through a lot of hands and a lot of changes, and then it was written on bamboo or wooden slats that were tied together with something that's probably was gone hundreds of years ago. So I think we see verses show up in 3 different places or things that maybe people had to come after the fact and make decisions about that, like Wang Pi or some of the different commentators, that with most of the text that we pick up to try to get it, we don't have nearly those kinds of issues. Is that fair to say?
I'd say almost all ancient texts, there's some issues like that you have to deal with. And even with the Analects of Confucius, for example, there's a lot of controversy over which parts are really from Confucius and which parts are not. Um, the Tao Te Ching is very short, which is one big advantage for those who want to understand it. You don't have to spend, as you well know, you don't have to spend weeks and weeks reading it. I'm reading through the Dream of Red Mansions, which was one of the great Chinese novels, maybe the greatest Chinese novel. Some people even compare it to Shakespeare. And I'm almost at the end, but it's been taking me months to read the thing. Uh, the Tao Te Ching doesn't take that long if you're reading in English, especially because it's fairly short. So there's you know, the enigmatic parts of the Tao Te Ching are enigmatic partly because of language and partly because of the very concise language that Lao Tzu uses. But there are some difficulties in the text, which even if you know the background and even if you know the language, you still might not completely overcome. And that's partly a matter of how you interpret key phrases, key terms, and especially chapter 5, which in some ways, some people interpret the whole Tao Te Ching from chapter 5. Chapter 5 is the chapter that says, 天地不仁，以万物为刍狗。圣人不仁，以百姓为刍狗. Heaven and earth are not humane or not kind. They treat all the things like straw dogs. The sage is not kind. He treats all the people like straw dogs. And a straw dog is something you discard after the sacrifice, not something of value, not something you care for very much. And therefore, some people interpret the entire Tao Te Ching as being a kind of a naturalistic picture of reality. And I'm not saying that's a totally illegitimate, but what I am saying is, first of all, you need to read that chapter in the context of the entire Tao Te Ching. And secondly, you need to read the Tao Te Ching in the context of ancient Chinese literature in general in order to really understand what's going on. The next best thing is, if you don't want to read all the ancient Chinese literature, is to read 2 or 3 different translators who do have a fix on how people thought in those times. And Lin Yutang would certainly be one of them, and James Legge would be another. Just make sure it's a good idea to pick people who have slightly different points of view and, do those 2 things, and you probably understand the text without too much effort, because it's not a very long book. However, there will be some extra pieces left over. There's going to be some things you may not quite understand, which I certainly is my situation as well.
Yeah. Now, and I would like to put a warning out for readers of translations of the Tao Te Ching, and that is that there is a whole class of translations, air quotes, that have been made by people who could not order from a Chinese menu, because what they've done is they've taken a bunch of English translations and they've picked what they like and built a translation entirely out of that. I'm thinking of Witterbinner or some of the more fanciful versions of the Tao Te Ching that are floating around there.
Yes, and Mitchell was one of them. Can I tell a funny story about a related, not exactly in the Tao Te Ching, but having to do with translation? Several years ago, after COVID, there was the House Republicans in the United States somehow read a document from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where the COVID supposedly came from, possibly, I don't know. And they came to the conclusion that this small building, which was like 6 or 7 stories, had spent $500 million on fixing its air conditioning unit. $500 million. And this story kind of went viral. Tucker Carlson picked it up and he talked about it on his show. The National Review picked it up and they talked about it in their magazine. And everybody took it for granted this was correct. The U.S. House Republicans, Tucker Carlson, the National Review, I looked at the original document, and it turned out it wasn't $500 million. It was $500,000. So yes, if you're gonna bad translations are all over the place, and they can be very influential and they can go viral in a minute. And you have to be very careful when you're quoting somebody from the ancient world that you're getting them right, because there's a lot of miscommunications and misinterpretations out there.
Um,
So yes, you have to be careful with translation, and you have to be careful. As I tell my students all the time, is go back to the original source if you possibly can.
Right. And there's this idea that when there's a list of possible definitions for a term, that you get to pick whichever one of those you want,
Hmm.
as if the original writer had all those ambiguities implied. I was riding in an airplane from South America, and the part in the airplane ride where the stewardess tells you how the seatbelt works. And she was a Spanish speaker, but she had been given a thing about how you tell this in English. And she learned it very well in English. And she said, you take the buckle and you insert the language into the buckle. And of course, what had happened was the word was tongue. This is the tongue that goes into the buckle. But, la lengua in Spanish, it can mean a tongue or it can mean a language. And in this case, they said, well, it couldn't mean a tongue, right? It's got to be the more sophisticated language, right? Or the more common usage language. So, this had been institutionalized. In other words, she was reading it off of the card. This wasn't her mistake. And I think that's what you're saying, is that these false distinctions get passed into a rubber stamp situation.
Hmm.
It seems like with the Tao Te Ching, there's a lot of how do I say this? There is a hermeneutical problem that we have whenever we go to try to understand something, and that is that we always want to understand it through the light of our already metabolized experience. We tend to want to understand things the way we already understand them, you might say, in translating. And it seems like the bigger the distance we're reaching across, the larger that problem is. Does that show up as a fair issue with the Tao Te Ching?
Yes. On the other hand, when I taught world literature, I like to start with ancient literature, precisely because I think in some ways young people can connect with it more easily than they can modern interpreters. Sometimes the language is fairly simple and straightforward in a lot of ancient texts, and sometimes it's more complicated and difficult. And I think Tao Te Ching is kind of a mixture of both. There are some parts that are really intuitive and people can grasp very easily, and other parts which take a little bit of analysis.
Mhm. Do you think over time commentaries got involved and tangled up with the original text?
Um, that's a good question, and I don't think I am qualified to answer that question. I think there probably would, because Taoism split into a couple of different, it went in a couple of different directions. One of them is Lao Zhuang thought. In Chinese, people say Lao Zhuang Sixiang, Lao Zhuang thought, which means Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, and it's more of a philosophical school. And then there was a Taoist religion, which maybe copied a little bit from Buddhism and went in a rather different direction. And tell you the truth, this is where I first encountered Taoism in a context which was not very beautiful or attractive. Um, I was as a young man, I kind of worked as a missionary in Taiwan, and
Oh.
another young man took me to what's called Snake Alley in Taiwan, in Taipei, where there were about 1,000 girls who had been sold into prostitution. Many of them were, teenagers, even as young as 14 years old. And he wanted me to see this, so we went there and we saw this. And in that neighborhood, there were many, many temples. There was a large Buddhist temple there, which is older than the United States, and there were many Taoist temples. What I discovered was that some men went to young prostitutes in in order to attain longer life, in order to extend their lifespan. And this is kind of in some ways, it's the opposite of original Taoist thinking. In some ways, it is a form of Taoist, a certain kind of Taoist religion, uh, because Taoist, the thought, the philosophy was that you don't need to worry so much about dying. You don't need to be afraid of dying. It's just part of life. It's part of the cycles of nature, perhaps. But some forms of Taoist religion went to the other direction and said, this is how we overcome death. This is a means of you find the herbs of the immortals, or you
Mhm.
find some other method through sex, or some other way of extending your life. So in a way it kind of split into two and went in some ways in opposite directions. Now, martial arts, in a sense, you could say, is a very natural extension of Taoist thinking because you are overcoming your opponent's strength by your own weakness, and you allow them. They're trying to punch you, and I mean, you know more about this than I do, but that's my understanding. And that was kind of what some of the religious Taoists were doing with Taoist thought.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think that we had a famous emperor die from mercury poisoning by trying to take a pill for immortality, I think, which was an
Yes.
extension of that. We also had some famous boxers during the Boxer Rebellion that thought they could become impervious to bullets by
Hmm.
doing certain internal practices. And I think the practices you're talking about involving young women, they refer to as dual cultivation. And I've had old kung fu masters tell me that when they were no longer interested in women, then their kung fu no good. Of course, because this is related to qi and jing and neijing, and and I think that there are the Taoists, I think, break into two schools: the external pill and the internal pill. So the internal pill people are doing yoga and trying to transmute qi to reverse the movement, to go back to our pre-birth condition. And the external pill people, and I think, you look at ginseng or you look at powerful, well done Chinese medicine, and it will transform a sick person back into a healthy person. And so there might be some idea that, good ginseng and a good formula, and yeah, we can actually support this Neijing, this
Yes.
uh the
I'm not
pre-birth
saying
qi.
that either school is illegitimate. I think there's something to be said for both of them.
But they both can go off over the guardrails. Uh,
Hmm.
I think, yeah, I think there's plenty of examples of that, and I think that you're familiar with this probably from Japan. Within Japanese Buddhism, they make the distinction between is it Tajiki and Rijiki, or my power, or trusting others, basically. And I think you see Taoism go that way also, where I knew people affiliated with the Feng Loi Kok Taoist temple, and there very much is what we might consider a kind of magical thinking that's going on there, where we're trying to romance or uh, attract supernatural energies to sort of support us in a certain way. Which from our understanding of shamanism, this is a very familiar shamanic sort of an avenue, I think.
Yes, and shamanism and consorting with the spirits is something that goes as far back as you can see in Chinese history. So does the Tao. The term Tao itself is not something that Lao Tzu invented. The term originally meant either path or route, or it could mean to speak. And in the ancient Chinese classics, which came before Lao Tzu, especially I've concentrated a little bit on the book of poetry or book of odes and the book of history, which
Both older than the Tao Te Ching.
they're much older than the Tao Te Ching. They're older than Confucius. They're supposedly Confucius edited them, but that's not very likely. And a lot of scholars would say that Lao Tzu was maybe at best a younger contemporary of Confucius, but traditionally he was thought to be older than Confucius.
Mhm.
Um, so this idea of the Tao, even though it originally meant pretty straightforward, even in modern Chinese or modern Japanese, michi, like road, the Tao, the same character is used for road in modern Japanese, even though it's given a Japanese pronunciation. Sometimes
Right.
it's given it's called do, like road, boulevard, or something like that.
Uh-huh.
So even in modern Chinese and Japanese, and in Korean, I believe too, the word can mean basically a route or a trail or a path something like that. And it can also mean to speak in a little bit older Chinese. But even in the oldest classics, it begins to have a bit of a metaphysical connotation to it.
Okay. Now I wanted to point out that there is etymology in Chinese, and that in the character Tao, we actually have two other characters that sort of composite it. And one is, you mentioned before, this idea of radical. And so for people who aren't familiar with Chinese, rather than it just being a mess of words, these words are actually kind of gathered into families, we might call them. And those families will get a certain mark so that we might know that this character belongs to this family. And then we catalog those characters as one stroke, two stroke, three stroke, four stroke, five stroke, up to God knows how many strokes. I think there's some amazing characters. But so the character Tao is of the family group, meaning to go. Is that right? And then the other
Yes.
part is actually the character for head.
Yes.
And so I've heard, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, the Red Pine. I don't know what you think about him. I'd be interested as a translator, but he brought up this idea, maybe borrowing from the Mangui texts, that this idea of Tao might actually be associated with the moon and the lunar cycles, and the head being the face of the moon that shows us, and the movement through the phases. And then he tries to track that lunar illusion through other verses. I just wanted to toss that out there, to see what you if you'd heard of that or thought about it,
That's a
or
sort of that's a sort of
fanciful.
explanation that I would be cautious about.
Now he's quoting another scholar when he comes up with that, and I see if I
Well,
have his
maybe
name.
I'll look into it, but I haven't heard that
Um,
explanation.
I will send it to you. Tu or Wei, maybe? Says Tao originally meant moon, and he's going back to the I Ching. But I think I just wanted to point out how these things change and move, coming out of other concepts that were changing and moving, and so the usage
Well,
might be very specific in the case of Lao Tzu.
yeah, and some people would say that the original character was in Dao, which is pronounced almost the same in modern Chinese, but it means to lead. Uh,
Interesting.
I did research the origins of the Tao, the term Tao, and I went back to the book of poetry and the book of history. The I Ching is a little bit more complicated because part of it is the original text, and then most of it is actually explanation of the original text, and the explanation is much later than the original text itself.
The
So
so-called
you have to make
wings.
make that distinction too.
The so-called
Uh,
wings attributed to Confucius, although we don't know.
well, I very much doubt Confucius had anything to do with it, but Confucius also used the word Tao. And for example, in a very famous book in conservative circles, which is The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis, in the back of the book, what do we call it? The back of the book? I can't think of the term right now. Eh,
Afterward, the pro
Afterward,
the what would it be? The post epilogue.
oh, I can't think of what it is. No, it's something a little different from that. At the end, uh, in the book, he uses the word Tao to describe universal morality, morality that transcends individual cultures, and that is can be found almost everywhere in the world in different forms. Maybe not exactly the same, but and he describes different aspects of universal morality, and he uses the word Tao. Now, that use of the word Tao actually comes from Confucius, because that's very much what Confucius meant, actually.
Okay.
So from what I can see, and I don't know what happened before the characters were formed, prehistory, I'm kind of cautious about trying to guess about that, extrapolate. But the earliest texts in ancient China already show the Tao as being something metaphysical and something that transcends just this ordinary concrete meaning of path or road, or maybe a route along a river, that tribute came from tributary countries to the capital, because the capital in ancient China was founded by the sage. The dynasty was founded by a sage. This is another key term in the Tao Te Ching. And one thing that would be, I think, a mistake would be to look at the Tao Te Ching and read it without understanding its context, both for the Tao and also for the sage, because the idea of a sage or shengren was a concept that went way, way back in China already. And the sage was a creator. He was, you could say, an entrepreneur. He was originally thought of as being a very powerful political person who founded a dynasty. He
Okay.
brought something new to the earth. But later on, well, Confucius said, I'm not worthy to call myself a sage. I'm never going to meet a guy like that. But Mencius, his disciple, couple 150 years later, said, there are King Wen and King Wu. Compared to Confucius, they're like chickens compared to a phoenix. In other words, Confucius, who had no political power whatsoever, was the ultimate sage because of the value of his teaching.
Right.
That's a revolution in thought.
Right. Now it sounds like we're getting close to the character duh. And Tao gets all the press, and duh just sort of slides in there and you never hear about it. But duh, to me, feels like where the rubber meets the road. Can you unfold duh for us a little bit? Again, this comes from a radical that has to do related to going, which is walking or stepping or strolling. But it gets more complicated because now mind and heart get in there, and eyes and observing get in there. And so it has this idea of moving with uprightness. Because my predisposition, I want to see phronesis in here from Aristotle, but that's my own compulsion. What do you think about duh
I
in
don't think
relation
that
to
I
what?
have any special understanding of duh. I mean, it's part of my Chinese name, actually. My Chinese name is Ma Dewei, uh, which a Taiwanese friend picked for me. I don't think I have any special understanding of the term. It can mean virtue. It can mean power. In modern Chinese, it usually means moral. And that's actually one of the controversies that we have been discussing on that Facebook page, about whether or not the Tao is moral, whether he's benevolent, it is benevolent, whether the Tao is an it or a he or she, or some sort of a transcendent being, and then whether or not it is benevolent or coldly impersonal, like chapter 5 seems to imply. And my take on that is, I think that if you read chapter 5 alone, you would get the impression that the Tao Te Ching, the Tao is impersonal and kind of like a force of nature. The you
Mhm.
know the, the survival of the fittest, nature red in tooth and claw. But if you read the whole book, then there's so many chapters that imply something very different. In fact, sometimes.
Is that fair to say? Something transcendent?
Yes, and not only not limited by the laws of nature, but something beyond the laws of nature, and something that is essentially good, as we might say. Shan is the word. In fact, let me just unfold a little text, which my student, one of my students,
Oh, very nice. Very nice.
wrote, gave to me. This says, the higher good or virtue is like water.
Oh, nice.
And that is, in some ways, the essential message of the Tao Te Ching from a certain perspective. The Tao Te Ching was written for a ruler, It was written as a political document telling us how to rule the country.
Like
And
frying a small fish.
like frying a small fish, yes, that's a very famous saying from the Tao Te Ching, which is very much directed at a ruler. Ruling a kingdom is like frying a small fish, which, how do you interpret that?
And don't mess it up.
Don't mess it up. Be gentle.
Be gentle, exactly. Don't
Yeah.
overdo it.
Don't overdo it. Yeah.
Yeah. Or just enough.
Right. And of course, water is something that near my house, there's a place called the Snoqualmie Falls, just a few minutes drive from here, which is a kind of famous waterfall, which tourists come to see. And the thing about water is it seems to be passive. It doesn't seem to force the issue, and yet it managed to wear away the Grand Canyon in the end. Um, if you shoot a bullet, you see the kung fu movies where the hero jumps into the water to escape the bandit, the triads, and they're shooting at him, and the bullet goes right through the water. Someone did an experiment on that, and they found that actually even a very high caliber bullet is not going to go very far into the water, and you actually can escape from the bad guys by jumping fairly deep into the water. So their water, it seems like very soft and weak and yielding, and yet it manages to overcome.
The best of men is like water.
Hmm. So this is what this is a passage that everybody in China knows, Shang Shan Ro Shui. And the other one that everybody knows in China is Dao Ke Dao, Fei Chang Dao, Ming Ke Ming, Fei Chang Ming. The Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. The name that can be named is not the true name, the constant name or the eternal name. Those are two phrases that everybody in China knows, but hardly anybody in China actually reads the Tao Te Ching anymore, unfortunately.
Right.
Maybe because the government doesn't emphasize it, and maybe one reason it doesn't emphasize it is because that's not really the way they want to rule. They want to fry their small fish of Taiwan. I don't know.
Yeah, they're flapping that fish all around the pan, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Yeah. The distinction that you made there seems to be the distinction that I come back to all the time. And for me, I pose that as the distinction between propositional knowledge and dispositional knowledge. And so when I hear the name and the immortal name or the absolute name, or that the Tao which can be spoken is not the true Tao. These are all different translations. Um, what I see is Lao Tzu sort of cautioning us: don't confuse the reality with the cognitive picture you have of the reality. Is that have I hyper white personed that? Am I post phenomenalist over the line, do you think? What do you get out of that distinction from a 6th century ancient Chinese
Well, the
viewpoint?
irony, of course, is that Lao Tzu was actually writing this book. So he was trying to express in words what he said cannot be expressed in words.
And I'm thinking of the wheelwright from Chuang-Tzu saying, I can't explain how to make wheels. I just make wheels. And now that I've done it, I've got it. But that to me is like the holding up of dispositional knowledge next to this idea of fine sounding words, which are not true.
Yes, and we cannot fully express in words what we. I think one of the Chinese rulers, I think it was Han Wudi, climbed to the top of Mount Tai, which is ancient China had 5 sacred peaks. Originally it was 4, but then they decided it was 5, corresponding to the 5 directions, including center. Mount Tai is the eastern peak, and it was the most sacred of the 5 peaks. Han Wudi climbed to the top of Mount Tai, and he left a monument with no words on it, because you couldn't really express what you're trying to say and what you experience in words. Um, Sorry, what was your question again? I think I forgot it.
Well, I'm interested if he's giving us a caution to not mistake our picture of reality for reality. I mean, when we get on to later, when he says, and this gets translated a lot of different ways. Lin Yutong says, oftentimes with desire, we view things, and then juxtaposing that to viewing things without desire. One way we see the secret of life, and one way we see the manifest forms. And I know that gets translated. Like, there's a lot of murkiness to pull out that. But I'm interested, is he directing us towards spiritual experience so that we don't fall for appearance? Is this appearance and reality like Plato, or is this a Platonic overlay of mine?
Of course, Lao Tzu is using paradox, and sometimes the danger of paradox is either you take it too literally, and the other danger is that you think it's nonsense. Um, Take a term like the English word God, for example. The word God, who knows where it came from in you know Germanic languages. I've looked up this a little bit. And I couldn't find exactly where it came from, but it probably didn't mean anything like what it means in the Christian or Jewish thinking today. Although there were ideas of the supreme God in many countries around the world. Um, what the Tao Te Ching does is tell us, don't think you understand what you're talking about, really. You use the word, and it corresponds to something you think it is meant to represent something, but it doesn't exhaust that thing. And that's even true when we're talking to one another. I mean, how much do we know about ourselves, let alone each other, through a short conversation? It, like much in the Tao Te Ching, it teaches us humility, I think. Teaches, epistemological humility, and it teaches us other kinds of humility as well.
Mhm. But he's also gesturing at the gate to the mystery of mysteries, right? Or this meow. I've heard that maybe it meant something different than mysterious way back when he used it, but I have no, way to know one way or the other. But it seems like he's gesturing towards, there's some way here you can get beyond appearance. You just won't be able to talk about it. I'm thinking of William James, and he has his four, in the varieties of religious experience. He's got his four qualities, and one of them is ineffability. You won't be able to talk about this. But another one is noetic quality, meaning this experience will have an authority of its own. And it feels like, and again, I want to know whether I'm committing a hermeneutic sin by seeing what I want to see in Lao Tzu, and that may be part of its value as well. But, or am I reading in there something that might be not that explicit? I mean, I'm just interested in what you think about that.
One does wonder what Lao Tzu's mystical experiences might have been prior to writing the book. Um, I'm going to be agnostic on the subject.
Okay.
I think there are hints and suggestions, and there's all kinds of possibilities. In the ancient Chinese writings, in the Book of Poetry in particular, the first 200 or so of the poems are about very commonplace events, marriage and washing dish clothes by the sea, by the river. And then the last 150 or so are about Shangdi and about spiritual transcendence, and partly through alcohol, actually, and partly through the spirits, how you're going to connect with God. Um, how did that relate? This is the background that Lao Tzu was writing from, I believe.
Uh-huh.
So exactly what that meant for him, I don't see a lot of mention. I mean, Shenpin, you did mention that there are some hints and suggestions of these intermediate spirits, but they're not very strong in the Tao Te Ching or in the
Uh-huh.
Zhuangzi either.
Uh-huh.
Um, so
He talks
whether
about not needing to leave the room, right? But being able to, I don't remember exactly the specs about that, but isn't there something about that the
well,
sage can inhabit one room and know everything in the creation? Is there something to?
and that kind of goes back to the classics too. because there was a even though the ancient Chinese kings could be very ruthless. I mean, there in some of the book of history there are instructions for exactly which limbs you're supposed to chop off for which sins. There was there was a bit of a concept that the king was also supposed to be not exactly passive, but he was supposed to accomplish things through wu wei, through non-action at times. So I don't think even that concept is, sui generis. It's not original completely to Lao Tzu.
Mhm. And I guess I'm feeling that that he's trying to give us, and maybe that's in the title. Was the title original? I guess I do wanna see virtue coming out of that. I like this idea of walking with an upright mind, which is what I'm taking out of the "duh." As much as, like, this idea that the sage wants to imitate the Tao, and the Tao creates all of creation, and that there's some higher way in which the sage can participate in that. Um, what do you I mean, is he leading us to behavior, do you think? I mean, I know you said this is directed at the ruler, but this is where the seed of virtue really has to be rooted, right?
Yeah, uh, and then the concept of the sage. Who is the sage? Is the sage just a ruler? I don't think so. I think that there are hints throughout the Tao Te Ching that the sage is more than just the ruler. That you can be sage-like. That we can all partake of the character of the Tao in some ways. Now, this one phrase, which was actually used to pretend to I won't say pretend. That's not nice. To argue that the Tao was non-personal and a force of nature. In chapter 79, the way of heaven has no favorites. It is constantly with the good person, on the side of the good person. Uh, that term "tian dao wu qin" is a phrase that comes from the ancient Chinese classics. Again, it goes back hundreds of years before then, and it's often used in both the book of, I would say often, maybe 6 or 7 times in slightly different terminology in the book of history and in the book of poetry. And it always meant not that the Tao was indifferent or that God was indifferent, because there it used the word God, not the word Tao. It didn't mean that. It rather meant that he is indifferent to, you know, politics. He's indifferent to who's important and who's famous and who's powerful, but is actually on the side of the good person. That implies that the Tao is not just interested in sages in the sense of people who have attained the highest peak of power in the nation under heaven, but he would also be interested in ordinary people as well, I think.
Mhm.
David, I'm wondering if we can go back to something that popped up a couple of times from both you and Brian about. I want to ask something like, I assume our listeners are mostly in the United States. How can we try to imagine how our mind would work differently because of the cultural differences between China and the West to understand the Tao Te Ching or Taoism more directly? Like what do you see as the missing pieces or the big differences that we can try to imagine?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I can. Nothing comes to mind at the moment. I mean, understanding how the people at the time thought, of course. Take very Paying very close attention to the meaning of these particular words. Reading a few different translations. The concept of wu wei, of acting without force or achieving without force, is something that is not just so much in contrast or in opposition to Western ways of thinking. It's in opposition to most ways of thinking, East or West. So in ancient China, we had the legalist school, we had Confucius, and Lao Tzu sometimes seems, and Zhuangzi seem to sometimes be mocking the Confucian school and thinking your morality that you talk about so much is a little bit too much, and it doesn't really achieve what you think it's going to achieve. In fact, the world will be better off with all this high flown morality that you keep on talking about. We'd probably get along better. We'd be nicer to one another without, but I don't think he's really saying what some people take him to be saying, that morality is not important or the Tao is not important. And then we had the legalist school, which basically said, I'm the law and I'm going to do whatever I want to, and I'm going to force everybody to obey my will. Now, that wasn't such an unfamiliar concept in the West. You know, you have Alexander the Great conquering the world. You have Julius Caesar conquering France and taking 1 million slaves. Um, it's something that actually synchronizes with our concept of evolution in some ways. The strong survive and lord it over the weak. So I think it's not so much that Lao Tzu was saying something that was Chinese, although it grew out of Chinese thought, and it's still difficult for Chinese to understand as well. It's not easy for anybody to really grasp this or to live by it. Living by it, of course, is the hard part.
So it seems to me like he's pointing out a human tendency is what you're saying, not necessarily a Chinese or a Western tendency, but that we have this tendency to want to see things maybe with desire. What do you think about the Chinese distinction in chapter 1? Viewing things with desire or viewing things without desire. You know, I have Jonathan Starr's translation, which I don't like the translation that much, but it gives you the Chinese. And I
Go ahead
I
and go ahead and read it.
I believe it's from the Wang Pi translation. And so let's see here. Yu Ming Huan Wu Shi Mu. Uh, no, is that the
Or maybe the English would be better.
well, it gets translated as or here we go. Ku Chang Wu Yu Yi Guan Qi Miao. Therefore, thus, hence, indeed, always, ever, constantly, without deep-seated desire. That's the you. Wu yu, without deep-seated desire. Yi Quan then perceive, see, truly recognize Qi Miao, the world's mystery or essence. And so that typically gets translated as that if I'll see the essence of things if I look without desire. That's that woo you. And then the next line, Chang yu yi quan chi chao. Uh, always, ever, same Chang, you having or possessing that you, that is desires, thought. And here he says, desires or thought constructs or mental patterns or attachment or fixed way of seeing or seeing the world through the lens of your mind, i.e., normal consciousness, Yiquan, then one perceives Chi Chao, its outer forms, its manifestations, what I think of as the ever popular 10,000 things, somehow suggesting that we can shift modes, in that in one mode we go around like our normal day with interacting with things, but that this other mode, woo you, somehow lifts us beyond that and enables us to penetrate to the essence of things. and that is where we get into this meow idea. Um, of mysterious is the way this typically they're translating meow. And I believe that in maybe
Would be wonderful.
in the Mawangui text there might be a hung instead of meow. But I don't recall that entirely. But what do you think about that shift? It seems like it's pointing to a mode shift that will maybe steer us towards walking with an upright mind in the world.
Um, yeah, I mean, that sounds plausible to me. I'll tell you one thing though. I lived in Changsha for a few years, where the Mawangui scroll was discovered, and I very
Right.
much regretted that they had torn down the old museum, and they weren't putting anything on exhibit while I was there, while they were building the new museum. So I very much regret not seeing that.
And this
Uh,
was the '90s, right? 93 or something like
no,
that?
that would be about 12, 13 years ago.
Oh, okay. But and maybe the texts were found in '93? Is that when
Oh,
the
the texts
Mowgli
were
scroll?
found quite a bit earlier, yeah, but the museum was shut down for a while while they were building a brand new spanking beautiful museum, which I never had a chance to look into. Uh, no, I don't have any particular interpretation of that. I mean, one thing I think I would be careful about is some people kind of uh, anachronistically read Buddhism back into the Tao Te Ching, and I'd be careful about that, because that is a possibility when you're talking about desire. You could
Or
look at some of
attachment?
the attachment. Yeah, it's possible to read some of those concepts from later Buddhism into the Tao Te Ching. But certainly, when you have the picture of the sage sitting by the grave of his wife, and his disciples come up to him and say, "Why are you singing songs?" And he says, "Well, didn't you love your wife?" And he says, "Well, when I first thought about it, I was heartbroken, but then I realized that this is part of nature, and how the cycle of nature goes around." Uh,
And this is, of course, Chuang-Tzu.
yeah, in Zhuangzi, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
We can you can see how that might be, that detaching from desire might be part of the Tao and part of becoming a sage, but I don't think it's an absolute detachment from desire, because
Mhm.
we can see that Wu Wei are Wu Bu Wei, even though we don't force things, and yet we still manage to achieve our goals. So there is that element in the Tao Te Ching as well. So there must be some kernel of intent or desire still left, but it's a humbler kind of desire, I guess.
Mhm. And I guess I feel like there's a message here also somehow around presence. And again, this might be a Buddhistic cross contamination because, my model is I want to say that there is this way that nature works and there's this way that the human nature works, and that all these different religious traditions are getting some window on describing the same elephant, to use the popular usage of the elephant. And so, because I want to see the elephant, I don't just want to understand the interaction with the tail or the interaction with the trunk. So I'm always sort of trying to find common threads, which is a very, very slippery slope because you can mistake seeing what you want to see for what you're actually seeing. Um, and yet I want to think that because we did an episode about Ibn al Arabi, who's a Sufi, and a lot of the things that the Sufi mystics say start to feel very Taoist. Some of the things that the traditional, like the Baal Shem Tov or some of the Jewish mystics sound, again, it's different language, different setting, but I'm trying to translate, like as a post phenomenologist, what was the human experience, because they had the experience. Then they had to pick some way propositionally to try to communicate it, which we just decided from the very beginning is impossible. but we still try to do it anyway. So I'm trying to feel through this, and I feel like the Tao Te Ching is one of the first places where I felt that awareness of a mode shift that was possible for humans, where someone was going, you can think differently about things, and all of your experience of reality will shift. And Boaz, you had mentioned that there is some connection maybe to be made between the modern Christian and some of the Jewish traditions, as far as are we moving around the same center and just looking at different ways into the ineffable? I'm interested if you have, stepping away from just the classical setting, is there some commonality here, some thread of human mystical experience or metaphysical?
Yeah, maybe
'Cause,
that's where Yuan Jiming comes in, David. What did you learn comparing Western or Christian and Chinese religion, or religious tradition, and the Tao Te Ching and Christianity in particular? And why was Yuan Jiming controversial?
Well, Yuan Jimin is controversial because he says that the Tao is God, and he says that the sage is the ultimate fulfillment or description of the sage is Jesus. Um, this is controversial both to many Christians and to many non-Christians. Uh, as far as his hermeneutics go and his exegesis, um, some of his exegesis is a little on the wild side, which I try to find, but I found some interesting insights as well in what he had to say. Um,
well,
um,
it
maybe not
reminded
asking.
me of Carl Jung saying he thought Jesus was the only completely individuated person that he had, an idea of. And it seems to me that maybe Jesus has become a placeholder for a spiritual aspiration in general, and comes to take on
Well, when it comes to this particular concept of Wu Wei, um, and I think this is something Lin Yutang also mentioned, and John Wu, his friend, who wrote the Constitution, the Nationalist Constitution for China. They were both very interested in the subject of how Jesus relates to Lao Tzu. Lin Yutang said that Jesus and Lao Tzu are brothers. However, let me just give you a little history of Lin Yutang because somebody that I find him a very interesting man. Um, Lin Yutang was born in the city of Xiamen, a little bit outside of the city of Xiamen, and his father was a Christian preacher. But Lin Yutang rebelled against that because he felt like he was disrespecting the Chinese tradition. He went off to also to St. John's University, apparently a different one, in Shanghai, and he decided he was going to read all the books in the library. So he read all the books in the library, and he became what he called a pagan, but he believed that pagans believed in God. Then he became a very famous, he wrote books on Chinese and Indian, there's a anthology of Chinese and Indian writings that he edited. More Chinese than Indian, actually, because of course he lived in a time when China was beset by many troubles, with the Japanese invading and China having had peace after peace taken away from it by different imperial powers. He uh, China was on the defensive, and he wanted to stand up for China, and so he wrote books on Chinese philosophy to show Westerners how great the Chinese tradition was. Then the communists took over, and he left the country, went off to Paris. He went to New York. He ended up living on the mountain above Taipei, and he ended up writing a book called "From Pagan to Christian," where he recounted his return to, and he told the whole story of Chinese tradition, a very loving mix of autobiography and history, philosophical history. He began with ancient China and the ancient Chinese classics. His favorite of all Chinese writers was Zhuangzi. He considered Zhuangzi the greatest prose writer in Chinese history. but he was also very fond of Confucius and Lao Tzu, and apparently Buddha as well. Then, when he came to modern times, he really felt like the communists and materialism was not the answer for China, and it was something that had taken China off in the wrong direction. Now I forgot what point I was trying to make by telling his story.
Well, the idea is like the similarity of a picture of transcendence. I mean, because I
Oh,
feel like there's a paradox between behavior in the world and the sort of transmuting our experience of
oh,
behavior in the world through a transcendent experience.
yes, the concept of Wu Wei. So what it came down to for him was that Lao Tzu was a brilliant writer, but we didn't know what he actually did. And so the portrait of Jesus in the Gospels is someone who teaches many very similar things to Lao Tzu about loving your enemy and going the extra mile and things like that, which seem to incarnate, and then, of course, in the denouement, dying on the cross for the sins of the world, incarnate the teaching of Lao Tzu about overcoming strength with weakness. Now, in ancient Western history, this was not the mainstream. The mainstream was Alexander the Great and, of course, our friend Julius Caesar, whom Shakespeare did such a wonderful job of portraying. Um, in fact, I think in Western thought, I can't, I mean, the Stoics, I love the Stoics, uh, but I don't see a very other really close parallel in ancient Western thought to the Tao Te Ching. I think the Tao Te Ching surpasses them. The Stoics are my favorite philosophers, and when it comes to moral philosophy, I think would be I greatly admire some of the Buddhists and the Tao Te Ching and Zhuangzi, but also the Stoics in the West.
Yeah.
Oh,
Or maybe Parmenides or Heraclitus. Some of those maybe that predated the Stoics may have a role in there.
yeah, overcoming evil through good is not a, an, the normal way of doing things.
Mhm.
There's a parallel there, maybe more on the point of Wu Wei, where I'm more familiar with the I Ching than the Tao Te Ching, but I believe the concept is the same. Where there's kind of like a recurring admonition away from ambition that I find paradoxical, and I don't know if I just find it paradoxical relative to my Western culture or my being in the world instead of in a cave or whatever. But even if you're in a cave, you kind of have to like figure out what you're going to eat, or if you're in the world but living simply, you're still going to decide to buy a house or to get married or to apply for a job or etc. And so th- I wonder if you can say more about um, you're equating good with passive and bad with active, I think, in what you just said.
Not
And
exactly. Not
yeah,
exactly.
lay it on.
Um, Going back to Lin Yutang, he certainly wasn't saying that a person who acts passively in the world is going to accomplish a great deal. But if you have somebody like, say, Mahatma Gandhi, for example, Gandhi applied those teachings, which he got from various ancient teachers, including Jesus, and I don't know if he read the Tao Te Ching or not, but he applied those teachings, and then Martin Luther King, of course, to do something very concrete in the world, very much like the sage of Lao Tzu, in fact, because they overcame strength with weakness, fasting and praying and protesting and even being willing to give up their lives, as both of them ultimately did, being assassinated. I think those are exemplars of what Lao Tzu was talking about, and what also one can see in the gospel and the original Christian documents as well. So it's not it's not passive exactly.
Mhm. Let me try this on you. You know, as a longtime martial artist, you know, starting at the age of 12, um, I suspect that he's actually pointing to something that's think it's a phenomenon that very few people experience. Um, you know, there's a saying, do a thing 100 times and it becomes difficult. Do it 1,000 times and it becomes easy. But do it 1,000 times 1,000 or 10,000 times 10,000, and you no longer do it, but it does itself through you. And only then is that which is done well done. So I think that he isn't saying that we don't try, but I think he's saying that when we break through, we will transcend all trying and it will become easy. This is contaminated by Buddhism, maybe this
I don't think so.
beginner's mind idea, but
This
I
is in Zhuangzi
know,
too. This is in Zhuangzi too.
yeah,
His
and I mean, because
stories of the
in my
master carpenter.
experiences, yeah, my experience has been that when I got to a certain level in martial arts, I could make some things happen very easily that had been very difficult up until a breakthrough point. And then
Yeah.
I was throwing out people out of bars that were 10 inches taller than me. And, you know, we say in our lineage that the fast beating the slow or the strong beating the weak is not a do. It's not an art. It's the state of nature. But through the application of a do and this transcension that can have this or transmutation of ourselves, we operate on a different level. And then there is a definite effortlessness that honestly will make you go, whoa. You know, and I think we see this with expert musicians. When I was a child, a college kid, child, I got a chance to watch Joe Pass play guitar from about 12 feet away. And it became evident to me that he had attained a state of Wu Wei. There was no trying. You didn't perceive any effort. But what you did see, which I thought was very interesting, was that as he tuned his guitar, he took it out of the case and he strummed it and it was out of tune and his face screwed up. And then as he tuned it and it came into tune, his face became peaceful. And then he played without any thinking, without any effort, without any striving. Uh, you know, he just did it. And you could see that something had been transcended there. You know, he had gotten to this breakthrough point. So I think that again, what we're getting from Lao Tzu isn't saying, oh, here's this thing, just do it. It's maybe closer to Han Shan saying, hey, try to make it to Cold Mountain, but your heart has to be like mine to get here, to get to this place. You need to leave the way you normally do things to get this breakthrough point. But I see these does as little ways to point to this big dough that if we can do it in archery or if we can do it in flower arranging or if we can do it in judo, maybe we'll get the gestalt somehow. We'll get that this thing happens. And then if we're really lucky and we transcend, we can do this in life itself and be good, but not because we're trying to be good, but because it is our natural disposition that when things happen, we naturally respond with with humanity and justice without a propositional calculation that says, "Oh, behave with humanity, behave with justice." It's just our inner
So
nature being manifested. How does that feel to you?
so how do in that way of thinking, what role would the master play?
He would be the phronimos in Aristotle's word, the exemplar who we strive to emulate. The Chunsu,
Yes,
hopefully.
yes. Of course, there are differences about what the character of the Tao is, and therefore what the ultimate nature of the Tao is, and therefore what a sage should be doing. And those are questions that are not necessarily easy to resolve. And there's no way of sweeping them under the rug and say we just have to go with the flow and and nature will guide us. But one thing I like about the mixture of ancient texts in China, and you get a bit of this in the Greeks too, is that the different schools, they argue with one another, they fight with each other, but they also complement each other as well, I think. And even within the Lao Zhuang school, Lao Tzu is epigrams, very concise, very thought provoking, sometimes hard to grasp. Zhuangzi is telling us the same thing, and maybe not exactly the same thing. We shouldn't assume that they're really all, in sync with on everything. They might have disagreed profoundly on some things, but he's telling us through these beautiful stories, which Lin Yutang loves so much, and those stories describe it very much what you're talking about someone who is becoming such a master at their trade that ultimately what they do seems to take no effort at all, and yet they produce the highest results. And maybe their sword doesn't even become,
Dull.
rusty or dull after many uses because they know how to cut exactly the slices of meat.
Which is, of course, Chuang-Tzu and the
Hmm.
butcher, who never sharpens his knife, and it is as if the bullock just falls apart. I think it's one of Lin Yutang's Chuang-Tzu stories.
Hmm.
Um, what do you think modern people have to get from the Tao Te Ching? I feel like we're in a time where transcension is maybe sits in a different place than it has in prior history. Now, maybe that's just my interpreting a hungriness on the part of moderns for meaning of some kind. But it seems like we're in a time where materiality, like literally our dreams can be, delivered by Amazon tomorrow. And it seems like on the material level, things are fulfilled largely, not for everyone, but as far as the first world is concerned. And yet, paradoxically, there seems to be a hunger for meaning that maybe I didn't feel back when I was younger. It felt like there was more of a things felt less lost, maybe, or things felt less hollow, or maybe there were traditional values that translated into family and community, and maybe there were elements of meaning that have been recontextualized now. But what do you think, just speaking to a modern person looking for meaning, what do you think the Tao Te Ching represents?
Well, I think anybody who's listened to us so far have probably picked up on quite a few things that the Tao Te Ching represents and that are of value to us today. Uh, of course, I don't want to say no worries because who am I to say that? It's not like I never worry. Humility, I would just recommend that the listener open a couple of different copies, different versions, different translations of the Tao Te Ching and read it for yourself and see what you get because, it's certainly stuck with me. I mentioned the, uh, I mentioned my first encounter with with a form of Taoism that was very repugnant. And it was only later that I began to read the Tao Te Ching myself and the Zhuangzi and recognize the beauty of these texts and the insight of these texts and their amazing applicability to human life. Now, one of the things about the Zhuangzi is it's very rare in an ancient text in particular for the heroes to be nobody.
Or infinite, or muddle-headed, no such person.
Well, yeah, or people who are birds, giant birds, or maybe that happens a little more often, but cripples. In one of his greatest stories, 3 or 4 friends who are all crippled and they're on the verge of dying. They're the heroes. And I love that because if you go back to, for example, the Sumerian extant Sumerian writings, as far as I know, there's only one story about an ordinary person, and that's a schoolboy who goes to school and gets in trouble for being late for school, and then his parents invite his teacher over to kiss up to the teacher. That's about the only story I know in ancient Sumerian literature where the hero is not either a god, or B, a king,
Or a demigod. Yeah.
or a demigod, something in
Yeah.
between, or maybe a combination of both. It's kind of rare in ancient literature to find a text like the Zhuangzi in which the heroes are people who are very much on the margins of society. It's something that we've understood a little bit better, I think, in recent years, to pay attention to those people on the margins. But I think Zhuangzi is one of the first people who really gets that.
And that's what got me to stuck on the Lin Yutang version, because when I started, I didn't have the resources to parse translations. But the Lin Yutang published by the Modern Library, I'll put it up here, called The Wisdom of Lao Tzu, has verses from Chuang-Tzu along with it. And I felt like that really did help me a lot. It kind of opened up things. Even if they don't have exactly the same picture, they definitely are harmonious enough that it helps you get the ideas. And they're so wonderful. Chuang-Tzu stories are so wonderful. I can't underscore that enough. Like, the one that I love is The Barmaids of Sung, where he goes to one of our heroes goes to a bar and he sees that there's two barmaids, and one is very pretty and one is very ugly. And the very ugly one is in higher status than the very pretty one. And so he asks the boy that works there, "What's going on here?" And the kid tells him, "Well, the pretty one thinks she's pretty, so we don't think she's pretty. And the ugly one thinks she's ugly, so we don't think she's ugly." And there's just so many of these things that are just so wonderful, the way that he puts them there. Um,
Su- Surprisingly, there is an ancient text in China, uh, which is a Confucian text, and it's basically a history of exemplary women. And at the end of the story, because this is something I've been writing about lately, I wrote a book about Jesus and women. And ancient China was not very friendly to women in general. It became less so over the centuries. And this is a Confucian text, the Confucian school generally gets blamed for a lot of that, although Confucius himself didn't seem to have any particularly bad relationships with women. But later on, Confucianism became much more strict, confining. However, in some of the early stories, there are characters who are a lot like some of the characters in the Zhuangzi, who are deformed, goiters, not attractive at all. And they somehow managed to marry the king. And because they chastise the king and they stand up in front of him and tell him, this is what you should be doing. You shouldn't be acting like a pig. You should be defending your country. You should be doing what's right. And they somehow that attracts the king, and they wind up, not exactly founding a dynasty, but having a very famous son as the next king. So there's a little bit of that kind of spreads out from Zhuangzi, I think, into the greater culture, because the Chinese three religions, they say there's three religions in China. I'd say there's more like 8 or 9 major religious traditions, but the so-called three religions of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, they're not compartmentalized down through the centuries. Since the time the early sages, they had their fights, and they had their disagreements. But in later dynasties, the dynasties tended to combine the schools. So, however, the Confucian idea became a little bit rigid in later centuries.
Mhm.
So it's good to see that influence of Zhuangzi on some of the early Confucianism.
Right. Are you familiar with the story of the three vinegar tasters?
That doesn't ring a bell.
Where they say, the Taoist, and the Confucian taste vinegar, and the one says it's sour, and the one says it's bitter, and
Oh,
the other says it's sweet. But I
hmm.
can't ever remember who says which, and the story behind that. So I was wondering if you could fill
No,
in that if you knew it. But if
doesn't ring a bell. I'm a China scholar, but China has such a long history and so many stories that doesn't mean I know them all.
Right. No, of course. Of course.
David, maybe in terms of bringing some personal stuff into this as we wind up, how did you end up doing this? What got you into it? What floats your boat about it most?
Well, I was a missionary and then I became a scholar. So, in that sense, my background is a little bit like James Legg's background. Uh, and the idea of how religious faiths relate to one another and how they fit together. I'm kind of a big picture person. I like to see the big picture, like you said, you mentioned you do as well, Brian.
Mhm.
Um, so that's what I've been working on. That's what I did my doctoral dissertation on. Actually, was trying to connect Christianity and the Chinese tradition. But even when I teach my students, this is one of the principles that I generally instruct them to do is to look outside of that, like Plato's cave, get outside there and look at a bigger frame. In Chinese, they have the expression sitting in a well looking at the sky, a frog sitting in the well looking at the sky, and he only sees a tiny piece of the sky. Um, whether you're speaking in public, as I was teaching public speaking at Peking University, uh, or you're just trying to understand something, this is, I think, one of the most essential things to do is to try to look at the bigger sky. So I guess that's part of my nature is to look for these sorts of things.
Help me
But I
connect public speaking to that, David. That's a little bit of a non sequitur to me, but I'm sure there's a connection that I'm just not understanding.
okay. Um, Let me give an example from a student speech at Peking University in my class. One student gave a speech arguing that AI was going to end the human race. Okay, end the human race, and you're focusing on science now, and you're talking about first of all, you're talking about how AI is going to take people's jobs away from them. And then you're talking about how it might surpass human intelligence in every possible way, and therefore it's going to end the human race entirely because human beings are going to be completely superseded. Now, how do we respond to that? I listened to the students ask questions, and they were supposed to ask challenging questions, and I didn't feel like their questions were quite challenging enough. So I approached the question after thinking about it a little bit. I approached the question from three larger perspectives, and I used the story of Plato's cave to teach people how to do this sort of thing. One perspective was, first of all, if there is, maybe there can be divine intervention, because in Chinese modern science fiction, you have stories about how human beings are about to do an experiment that's going to end the whole universe, destroy the whole universe, and therefore these beings from outer space come and they intervene and they stop the experiment. But we also have at the Temple of Heaven, at the Summer Palace, we have hints that this sort of thing has already happened in the past, in whether it's Buddhist or it's traditional Chinese, the Temple of Heaven. Um, Second point of view is if that's kind of the religious framework. Another larger framework would be if the AI surpasses human beings, it's more of a definitional framework. If AI surpasses us in every sense, then maybe they'll surpass us in compassion as well. And therefore, when they when AI gains this surpassing power, it will realize that what it's doing to human beings is not right, and it will kill itself and end itself. There's possibility number two. Possibility number three is, okay, let's look at a political angle, political framework. China and the United States are at odds right now. This is one of the most dangerous things going on in the world today, is the conflict between the United States and China. Maybe we can make peace. If you don't believe in God and you don't believe in benevolent Mr. Smith from the Matrix, then probably we better work on this peace thing a little bit.
It's just inefficient not to have peace.
So
Yeah.
public speaking, you're talking about kind of rhetoric is this is less about the delivery of content and more about how we think about what content we're delivering and
W most
okay.
most of the speeches tend to be too narrowly focused,
Mhm.
and therefore, if we look at it in a larger context, it often sheds new light on the subject that which is often neglected in our thinking. And of
Mhm.
course, these are the smartest kids in China, and therefore this is the most exclusive school in the world, along with Tsinghua University. They're very smart students, but even for them, it was difficult to go beyond this fairly narrow focus on my subject. This is my subject. This is what I'm studying. And I think this is probably an answer to your other question too, a little bit, because Laozi and Zhuangzi are not like that. They really do open your eyes to a bigger frame.
Getting out of the box is a type of intellectual discipline that requires a certain self-reflective component. And I think that we like to talk a lot about consciousness, conscious of consciousness, and that's something different than just being conscious. And I think a lot of that self-reflective faculty is involved in that. Um, is there any message that you want to communicate generally, and also are there books or articles or Substacks or anything that we can direct listeners to?
Well, since this is being recorded, I can just give you the link to that, I think might be the
Yeah.
most
Okay.
efficient thing to do.
Okay. So people are interested in that. Look in the description of this video, and we'll have all those different contact informations and resources. Boaz, was there any other threads?
There are probably many, but I think we're at a stopping point for today because I need to go make dinner. Um, David, a pleasure to have you, and pleasure to get to know you a little bit. And thank you for bringing your scholarship and yeah, sharing your insights with us.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure to talk with both of you and get to know you a little bit.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, I enjoy these conversations hugely. And we thank you, and perhaps we'll get a chance to talk again.
Sure.